We are introduced to the world of Jujutsu sorcery twice. We are introduced to a protagonist with a special grade cursed ability twice. The story of Jujutsu Kaisen begins twice, and the odd similarities and differences between these two beginnings are embodied by Yuta Okkotsu and Yuji Itadori. They are the focus of both introductory arcs, and how they are written, the cast and circumstances that surround them, tell us a lot about the different directions Gege Akutami took the narrative from the Cursed Child to Fearsome Womb arc, which leads us to present-day Jujutsu Kaisen. What we now know as Jujutsu Kaisen Zero originally started off as a self-contained series titled Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical School, a far worse name. It followed Yuta's induction into Jujutsu High, focusing on his relationship with Rika. It was a massive success, so less than 1 year later, it was retroactively made a prequel to the series we know today. Since there was so little time in between each beginning, it's worth noting that there are echoes of Yuta's first chapter within Yuji's first chapter that are clearly by design. The first page of any good comic or manga should tell us a lot about what the author is going for. Zero wastes no time showing the audience Yuta. This is his story. He's to be executed because of his violent actions. He doesn't mind because he's depressed, and he's being looked after by some bandaged freak. Jujutsu Kaisen keeps a near identical page layout, but chooses to open on a medium shot of a shed, followed by the date and location, the empty interior of the shed, and a close-up of Fushiguro Megumi looking frustrated with who we later find out is Gojo. The question is, why make these beginnings so similar? Visual similarity between the two works is something that Gege was well aware of. He even directly calls it out on this page, comparing his designs of Yuta and Fushiguro, and Inumaki and Yuji. This wasn't an accident. It was to tell us that we are being brought back to the same world, while using the best tool mangaka have to emphasize contrast: ink. Chapter 0.1's first page is mostly white. Yuta sits as if under a spotlight with a backdrop of white papers, and Gojo nearly blends into the white wall behind him. Jujutsu Kaisen is nearly all black, suggesting a darker story. The second and third pages for the first issues make up splash pages of the main character and his supporting cast. The contrast of tones is carried onto these pages. This is also where the personalities of the main characters are first shown to the audience. Yuta is anxious, but also tired and dressed distinctly from his peers. He's uncomfortable as he grips his chest. Yuji, on the other hand, blends right in. From his wardrobe, we'd never know he was just entering this world. He is surrounded by 4 black arms that don't threaten to attack him, but reach beyond him, able to strike out at others. Of all the 8 characters in both chapters, Yuji is the only one looking at the reader, the only one not following the gaze of the others. He quite literally has a different perspective than the rest. In retrospect, these 2 splash pages tell us quite a bit. Yuta's story will be about fitting in, finding his place in the world, and becoming comfortable with himself. Yuji's story will be about a man struggling in vain to hold back the darkness of this world. Yuta and Yuji begin their arcs as vastly different people, and their personalities are what bring them into conflict with their peers, and is the core reason behind the contrasting tones and endings. Yuta tried to kill himself. He can no longer take the harm that Rika inflicts on others. He's cartoonishly anxious around people, which leads to his real character dissection straight from Maki. Although he has a powerful curse protecting him, he plays the victim. He's a passive person without any goals. Bottom line, he's a scared boy who feels helpless in the world around him. We meet Yuji with friends at a club meeting. He's a team player with leadership qualities who is also brash and confident, even when confronted with his own failures. He cares for his dying grandfather, taking his last words to heart in a way that haunts him. Bottom line, he's easygoing and kind-hearted to a fault. These 2 protagonists may share similar circumstances, but they're complete inverses of one another. Nervous, confident, observant, airheaded, wants to die, wants to help. It's these traits that drive a wedge between the 2 beginnings of Jujutsu Kaisen. On the surface, there are a lot of similarities between these 2 arcs. Outcast Boy comes in contact with the cursed world and has a special great ability that scares the higher-ups into wanting that lad executed secretly. But Gojo manages to delay the sentence 'Cause he's cool. He meets his new classmates, there's some attitude clashing, they go on missions that end up going horribly wrong, but learn something about their new pals in the process. The broad brushstrokes are the same, but let's be fair and say even some of the more minute details do echo each other. It's pretty easy to see what these stories have in common, but it's the differences that snowball each arc into distinct narratives. In childhood, Yuda and Rika swore a vow to get married, but Rika was killed in a car accident and has been attached to Yuda as a curse ever since. In the beginning, Rika represents Yuda's fear, and he blames her for the terrors of his life. Toward the end of the battle with Geto, Yuda tells Rika that he loves her, and even kisses those big juicy lips of hers. Yuda is ready to sacrifice himself for his friends, and be with Rika forever, something he would have been terrified of at the beginning, going so far as to call their relationship pure love. But why does any of this matter? Isn't Rika just a fun quirk of the series that Yuda uses to fight the nasty man? Rika is part of Yuda. They are inextricably tied together by love and cannot be separated. The entire final chapter of this story is about Yuda's self-affirmation. Geto recognizes this, and he calls it the most important thing in life. Yet, that self-affirmation comes in two parts. Yuta first had to recognize the active role he needed to play in his desire to keep living. Maki helped him with that. But Yuta still needed to love himself. He could only do that by making peace with the part of himself that he always feared. It just so happens Rika doesn't represent a monster, but unconditional love. By the end of the story, we find out that it was Yuta who cursed Rika out of his love. He became afraid of his own love, but by the end, he accepts it again. Yuta can now move forward with people who depend on him because he has come to terms with who he truly is and accepts his own value as a person. By the end of the story, the Jujutsu world is saved from the evil schemes of Geto, and Yuta continues on with his newfound friends. The end. Yuji's story is starkly different. After arriving at the juvenile detention center and beginning his argument with Fushiguro, he is faced with battling a special grade curse alone. Chapter 7 is all about the ideas he's been struggling with since the beginning, but unlike with Yuta's self-affirmation victory, Yuji's entire worldview is being shattered. He needs to hold off the curse for enough time that Fushiguro and Kugisaki can escape. He knows he can't defeat the curse, but he didn't anticipate just how powerful it would be. Throughout the thrashing that Yuji receives, thoughts of regret seep into his mind. He realizes he was too naive, that he's not strong enough to die on his own terms, let alone to save others. All while the last words of his grandfather haunt every thought. Luckily for him, Fushiguro gives the signal and Sukuna takes over just in time. But Yuji's journey in this final fight is an antithesis to his purpose in life up to this point. He's too weak. He never should have acted how he did. The idea of a natural death for him or those he cares about is foolish. So why do we see Yuji go through such a traumatic experience, whereas Yuta's final battle was cathartic? Well, that's the difference between Tokyo Metropolitan Cursed Technical School and Jujutsu Kaisen. At the end of the day, Jujutsu Kaisen is always about the bleak reality of the Jujutsu world, where Yuji stands apart from everyone else, desperately trying to fight against the harsh truth that no one in this world dies a good death. He is a character riddled with guilt for situations that aren't even his fault. He is haunted by the idea of helping people. That is his defining character trait, and it is in direct opposition to the world around him. In many ways, Yuta was born for the Jujutsu world, whereas Yuji was born to destroy it or die trying. Despite the trauma he'd endured and all the evidence to the contrary, Yuji knows that his way of doing things was still right. In his last breath, he wishes Fushiguro a long life, the implication being that he'd have a natural death. This story ends, not with friends walking off together after a successful job saving the world, but with a Jujutsu sorcerer staring up at the sky because he can't bring himself to look at his dead friend. The stories of Yuda Okkotsu and Yuji Itadori begin nearly identical down to the layout of each arc's first page. But the journey each protagonist goes through, and how that journey concludes, ends up much different. Yuta is a boy who has to find the will to keep living. The final conflict comes down to a man trying to steal half of him, but through acceptance of that half, Yuta is victorious. His story is a very personal one that resolves itself within a short time span. Yuji is a boy who can't stop fighting to protect people in a world of despair, no matter how fruitless those efforts are. He is confronted by the cruel reality of his weakness and nearly gives into that despair until sacrificing himself to keep living up to his values. His conflict is with the dark world that surrounds him, and while this may be a hollow victory, he fought against that world until the end. That is how Yuta and Yuji represent two different tones for Jujutsu Kaisen. The story couldn't continue to follow Yuta in his lighter world. For things to progress with the shift in tone that Gege was interested in, he needed a new protagonist to lead the fight against the dark Jujutsu world in a sprawling epic that would take more than 4 chapters to tell. In a clever use of shared storytelling elements, Gege was able to guide the reader through a new Jujutsu sorcery story that ended up completely flipping his previous work on its head. The reason why Jujutsu Kaisen begins twice is because they are 2 stories in conversation. The Fearsome Womb arc was crafted in contrast to the Cursed Child arc. It's easy to see this contrast from the very first page, but it's successfully concluded through the similarities and differences between the 2 protagonists of the Jujutsu world.